Hello and welcome to this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, in the days of COVID-19, one of the big concerns, aside from, of course, survival, is the future and how Africa is going to rebuild itself in the wake of COVID-19. Even before the lockdown, there was a huge infrastructure gap. How is it going to be filled? Now, joining me now is Thabo Thamane, the chairman of the Association for African Development Finance Institutions. I say it's the million-dollar question in the continent right now. How is Africa going to fill this huge infrastructure gap that runs into hundreds of billions of dollars?
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are and whatever time it may be. Yes, that's a very critical question, Chris. And as part of the Association of African Development Finance Institutions, our role is to actually fill that gap where you need what you call catalytic input of development finance in infrastructure development. You know, filling the gap will require enormous resources and would require all actors, you know, to work with common purpose of scaling up infrastructure in the continent, as this, holds the key to the continuous development and achieving integration. Financing infrastructure requires huge capital. And I must say, at ADFI, we call it ADFI, the Association of African DFIs, this capital must be patient, Chris. It must be patient because, we are filling a gap that is quite historical and has been left for many years to build up. So, and if people bring in that capital, they must be able to have the patience for the capital to work for themselves or for the intended interventions. Also speaking as the chairman of the World Federation of Development Finance Institution, financing infrastructure is an area that we as DFIs can intervene because it's very critical for development. I think what is also critical is that we need to get all the development partners, we need to get all the angel investors, we need to get all the donors to be able to partner with Africa. That is the only way we can fill this gap. And not only that, Chris, what is also important is that Africa must be able to trade with itself, because the amount of trade between Africa and the rest of the world is so enormous, is so huge, that people must not see Africa as a risk. It's very interesting that from a business point of view, people see Africa as the go-to continent. But from spending money in development, especially infrastructure, donors and funders tend to talk about political risk, instability, and so on and so forth. But we are saying as DFIs, that must come to the end, and people must come to the party.
And that's one thing in this current world we're living in. Everywhere you look, on every single continent, in both hemispheres, there's an incredible amount of what one might be termed as a political risk at the moment. Yeah. When do you think that those days will be over, when people look to the Africa and the Southern Hemisphere and say, oh, sorry, it's too much risk for us? When do you think that'll be over?
I think it will be over. It will take some bit of time because, Africa is made up of, I think, about 53 countries or so. And all of them are sovereign states, and with different levels of developmental progress. But in terms of us being united as Africa through the AU and other structures, it is important to note that there's been significant progress. And I think when you look at the role that the African Development Bank is playing, they are really pushing for infrastructure development, especially with the high fives from the president of the AFDB and the key focus around agriculture. For me, I think risk will always be part and parcel of humanity. And there's risk everywhere, Chris. And you go to other countries outside of Africa, there's risk. But we go there. We travel to these places. And we are cautious of what the risks could be. But the fact of the matter is that risk will always be there. And it shouldn't delay the ability of our partners, our well-wishers to be able to take part in the development agenda.
Well, in terms of convincing the world to support the Africa infrastructure story, I mean, one of the things that came out during the COVID-19 crisis, the World Health Organization kept saying, listen, this is a world problem. This isn't just an African problem, and the world needs to get involved here. Do you think that that same kind of feeling is going to work when it comes to finance and investment?
Yes, I think. Look, we must take a disposition as the world to say this is not necessarily an African problem, but a world problem, and we must take a disposition. As leaders, history will judge you severely if, when you are given the opportunity to make a difference, you don't make a difference even on the basis of insufficient facts and figures, but on the basis of logic and what you intend to do. I think what is important is that the world must start taking a different view of what Africa is, because we've come a long way in Africa, and like I said, the trade between Africa and the rest of the world is huge. It runs into billions and billions of US dollars, and if that particular trade could actually be done between African states, then this infrastructure issue and infrastructure development gap would not necessarily be a problem.
And you mentioned just earlier, you said capital must be patient in building infrastructure, sure, but you'll probably find, as we're finding here, the international markets at the moment, the investors at the moment, they're slightly impatient because they're under pressure to bring about returns in these difficult times.
Yes, I know, Chris, and that's what I'm saying. At the end of the day, we've neglected infrastructure development in Africa. But we've always benefited from the natural resources coming from Africa. So for me, I don't believe that could be a reason that will still be used now. And I think it's something that, all the donors and people with money are trying to find an excuse of not putting money into infrastructure development properly here. Because, with all the natural resources and the wealth that we have, that needs to be beneficiated. Donors and funders will still make their money in the long term. So I don't see that being a problem. And I think, as you indicated, when you are not patient with the capital, you run the risk of having half-hearted approaches to this process.
Because isn't that one of the great things with infrastructure projects? They are long-term. That sometimes can take time to get your return. Sometimes there can be disputes with the government partner sometimes you're working with, and changes in specifications. How can that be overcome, you think, to gain more finance for infrastructure on this continent?
Yeah, I think that could be actually overcome using the Triple P model. And I think the Triple P model, one of the greatest impediments that I've come across, especially when I traverse the continent in Africa, is some of the legislations that are statutory rules that are imposed in certain governments, and the political will and commitment. I think that's what we need to fix, because you realize that triple Ps in sub-Saharan Africa are only concentrated in countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, which accounts for about 48% of all the PPPs infrastructure projects in the region in the last 25 years. So for me, I think it's a function of the government being able to create legislation that is pro triple Ps, and once that is put in place, then of course you see the inflows of capital quite easily and in a more sustainable manner.
And what about this job of blending private and public money to bring about infrastructure investment? How do you think the continent should go about that?
Blended finance, Chris, is one of the numerous tools that you can use to mitigate this risk that we are talking about and the ease of financing for private sector-led projects. And it has the potential to create a lot of social benefits. Because it combines concessional financing of loans that are extended on more general terms than market loans and commercial funding. It's a very delicate balance between return on investment, at the same time achieving the intended objectives. I think what is important is that we are beginning to see an increase in the public education, an increase in the interest of blended finance in Africa. And I think it is the way to go, because blended finance also is important because it also touches on the critical aspect of project preparation. That is the conception of the project at preparation stage to fruition. That is very important, because once you miss that step, you then tend to have projects that ordinarily will fail because they've not been prepared properly. And I think we need to encourage that. We need to talk a lot more about blended finance. We need to support it. The governments must come to the party, and the private sector for the fruition of such initiatives.
What do you think is the biggest problem that needs to be overcome with this blended finance option?
I think, like I said earlier on, even regarding the triple Ps, I think it's a question of rules and regulations around statutory frameworks in different countries. I think also it's a question of trust, and it's a question of each party putting everything on the table and saying, this is what I'm expecting at this particular rate, as an example, a rate of return. I think on that basis, if we operate on the basis of trust between the two parties, and understanding that government by their nature are responsible for social development, they must absorb much of the risk, because private money seeks a certain level of return within a certain period of time. So for as long as you want to go in and have a 50-50 arrangement of some sort where government is not taking the majority of the risk, this is where the biggest problem is. So governments must be able to absorb much of the risk and be able to be patient also for the private sector to bring in that capital for the benefit of the greater nations of Africa.
How is this going to play out in a continent where, to be quite frank with you, most government coffers are very under pressure, especially in the wake of COVID-19?
I think, Chris, it is important that we also look at the sustainability development goals, that has been put forward in terms of how we need to fund them. This particular gap between the need to fund the SDGs and the ability to fund them. And I think the other aspect is that if we focus on implementing the SDGs, a lot of assistance will come from foreign aid outside of Africa, and other multilateral organizations like the AFDB, like your World Bank and the IFC and others, KFW and others. And then again, we need to create opportunities, because even in the midst of the current COVID-19, where now governments are pressurized into looking at the health aspect of fighting the pandemic. It is important that you create these particular opportunities, and these opportunities can be in the area of better agricultural practice and energy efficient technology. We must be able to actually be moving forward with technology. We must get into the new way of doing this, the new normal post-COVID. And the other one is obviously around introduction of weather-based insurance. These are examples I'm giving, Chris, and also institutional innovations to improve sustainable food systems. And one aspect that I need to mention, Chris, is that water availability. Water is going to be the next important commodity outside of other what I can term as diamonds and coal and others. Water is going to be very, very critical, and I think it's important for us to prioritize and see where we put our money in terms of projects that are able to give us a meaningful return, both economically and socially.
What about the land of your birth, where you're talking to me from now, Botswana? I know it's ancient history now, but in the 1960s, when Botswana was born, you had, about 10 kilometers of tar road and a handful of graduates. And even in more recent times, I was there a couple of years ago for the first time in about 20 years, and I was stunned by the amount of infrastructure I saw that had gone up in 2 decades in Gaborone, in the capital. Do you think Africa can learn anything from Botswana's commitment to infrastructure?
Chris, yes, there's a lot that people can learn from Botswana. I think one thing that is very key is good leadership, and adherence to the rule of law and accountability, and the prudent financial management of the resources that we have. I think those are very key. And also the culture and adherence to our very natural culture that we tend to pride ourselves in. I think what is also important is that Botswana as a country is the longest continuous single democracy that is in the world, where we've held elections every 5 years since 1966. And of course, there's been one party that has been winning those particular elections. That's why I'm saying a single continuous democracy. And I think it's important because the will of people, people are given the opportunity to cast their votes. People are given the opportunity to choose their leaders. And I think those leaders, we've been blessed with leadership that subscribes to the Constitution of Botswana, and they respect the Constitution of Botswana. And this is what has brought us to where we are, because the leaders are there for the people, because they are servants of the people. And we can teach the rest of the world how we've succeeded over the last years since 1966. And it has been significant, Chris. I mean, the developments that you see here, the health, education, and other things. We were not saying we've done everything that needs to be done on earth, but we are basically saying, even though improvements are there, we've done significantly for the people, because the people come first.
And just to tell us as well, talking about the political will there in your country, it's a very small population even today in Botswana, and it was a lot smaller at independence. The government could have got away with putting a lot less infrastructure up because they don't have that many people to cater for. Why do you think that there has been this tremendous drive over the last 40 years to build up what Botswana has?
I think it's because Botswana it's a big country. I mean, about 582,000 square kilometers, the size of France or the state of Texas, and because of the current democracy principles that are entrenched in the system, people have got a right to stay where they want to stay in Botswana, and the government needs to actually bring developments to those people. And we respect the fact that people have the traditional villages where the local chiefs, which are also considered because they've got a structure which is recognized. It's called the House of Chiefs. These are the traditional leaders who were the ones that were leading us in years before independence and after independence. Because of this consultative process, villages that are designated as villages, government has an obligation to push social developments and infrastructure developments there. And therefore, when you look at the fact that it's a vast country, government was required to create and take developments throughout the rest of the country. And I think it has worked well for us. But it's costly also, Chris, because you can imagine the unit cost of production where you create a road that travels 400 kilometers to one end, and the number of cars that use it are not so much. But you still have to create it and take medical supplies there. You take power there, and so on and so forth.
So in my mind, I have the distant town of Maun when you were saying that. But anyway, just in terms of broadening it out now across the continent here, the African Development Bank and their High Five plan, it's if you read through it, it's actually an incredible ambition, shall we say, for this continent to achieve. But do you think how difficult is it going to be to get the money together to turn it into reality?
Capital raising is always a challenge, Chris. I think, and the AFDB is not necessarily immune to that particular challenge. I think what is very key, like I've indicated before, it is the critical support and unwavering support of all the governments and all the shareholders of AFDB in trying to put up money to achieve the high fives. This is a very ambitious strategy by AFDB and quite a very useful one and very relevant one for that matter, because if you don't focus on feeding ourselves as an example, then we'll have a problem, because you can only be meaningful in terms of be impactful when you are not hungry. So the only other thing is basically for all the shareholders of AFDB to see value in investing in the high fives, and also what the intention of the strategy is by the president of the African Development Bank. And I think we will achieve that. It is my hope and belief that even as Association of African DFIs will play a critical role of being a catalytical servant in the development value chain.
And what kind of reception are you getting at the moment? Bearing in mind, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, that a lot of the investors are perhaps going to hike up their cost of money because of what's been going on the last few months with COVID-19.
I think interestingly, and we are getting a lot more interest from funders and angel investors, especially in Europe and in Asia, who are very interested in partnering with the Association of African DFIs around resource mobilization and capacity building. For me, I think that signifies the fact that we need to go beyond COVID pandemic crisis, and we need to understand that there is more to life even beyond this current setback, which I believe is a momentary setback in my view. And I think this particular interest that is coming from other development partners is very interesting and very promising.
And what would be, let's just talk a little bit more detail on the ground, what would be the stellar projects? What would be the top big infrastructure projects on this continent to help make it tick, that you would identify as ones that need to be invested in?
I think what is very key is roads infrastructure, because they provide this connectivity between countries and areas. And another one that is quite significant is obviously power. And if you can imagine, there's very little percentage of proportion percentage of people that have access to energy and power in Africa in a certain aspect. And also water and sanitation, Chris. I think these are very key to me because, they can also be very, very key for investors to come in. Investors must be comfortable that they can be able to reach the route to market is reachable, and things like water and sanitation are available. Energy is very important. For me, those are the key infrastructure projects that need to be looked into.
It was once said to me many years ago by an infrastructure expert, talking about the power question, which dogs almost every country in the continent, maybe perhaps with the exception of yours. An infrastructure expert said to me that if all the nations in sub-Saharan Africa chipped in and invested in the Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it could solve the power problems of sub-Saharan Africa at a stroke. But what do you think is the reality of that?
Yeah, I think those things, and not only that one, Chris. There are many other things that we can do as an African continent by just coming together and really focusing our minds and efforts in some things that can actually solve the problems. But of course, like I said, those things are easier said than done. As African countries, through our different regional bodies like your SADC, ECOWAS, and others, we need to come to some form of agreement and say, what, rather than reinventing the wheel all over, why can't we just focus on who has the commodity to assist us and put our efforts in there? I think it's something that is doable, but obviously it's not easy. It needs a lot of political discussions. It needs a lot of political will. It needs a lot of give and takes. It needs a lot of sacrifices. So we can only encourage governments to be able to look into those other aspects. But at the end of the day, I guess our role as DFIs is to avail the possibilities that governments can actually tap into. And it will be up to governments to make a decision on that.
And what kind of incentives can government offer to private investors to come along and get involved in this blended finance we've been talking about?
Yeah, there are many incentives, Chris. I mean, others are, what you call, rebates on tax concessions could be one. Though tax is always a revenue earner for most governments, that could be another one for private sector people to assist in. And the other issue is obviously, examples of power purchase agreements in the area of energy that I can think of, which are long term. so that they give a comfort of tenure. So these are some of the typical examples that I can look into. And the other ones are obviously around road infrastructure, where you can have toll gates rather, that can be used to actually guarantee return on investment around certain particular money spent in those particular projects. There are so many of these incentives that can be done, but we need to be careful and be cautious of incentives that we give, because there should not be strings attached. You mustn't give out incentives that would at the end work against the very same intended development impact that you wanted to achieve. Like for instance, at the end of that particular agreement, let's say it's a road that links one country to the other, and then at the end of the incentives, the road is no longer there; it's dilapidated. We've got to be able to understand that by the time the private sector investor leaves, they must leave an infrastructure that is still usable. So we need to be very cautious around how we structure these investments, Chris.
Now, you mentioned power purchase agreements there, which are very fashionable talk at the moment. But just give me an idea. I know that Botswana is pretty dependent on coal, the same as neighbouring South Africa. What are you doing to try to diversify away to renewable energy?
Look, I think obviously that's not necessarily my field, and I would not necessarily be an authority to discuss much on that particular aspect. But from a development financing point of view, and from what I've seen, our government is encouraging even renewable energy, and but from my end where I am, we're encouraging green climate funding, and then we are trying to come up with certain initiatives that are still being baked and being cooked at the moment, where we can look at how we can encourage even beyond where we can want to get people to get into green energy and assist the energy situation in the country. But the government has invested a lot in some of the infrastructure around power generation in the country, and they continue to be the government of Botswana continues to be open for business, Chris.
Great. Well, on that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time here on this program. Thank you very much indeed to Thabo Thamane, the chairman of the Association for African Development Finance Institutions, who is coming to us there from Gaborone in Botswana. That's all we've got time for on this show, this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.